Okay, welcome back. This is week 5 of our Career Kickstart Bootcamp for GGU Law graduates. And just as a reminder to please print out the worksheet for today's session. Now, in our prior sessions, we took stock of your needs for your job search and identified your target job and target market. We explored relationships. And last week, we focused on branding your professional identity. In this week's program, which we'll talk about acing your job interviews. And then next week, we will wrap up the whole series with a discussion about accepting job offers, reviewing your progress, and moving forward. If you missed any of these sessions, you can watch the videos on the Law Career Development YouTube channel. Now, today's agenda will be focused on acing your job interviews. We'll discuss how to prepare for your interviews, how to use your worksheet from session 2 to construct winning answers. I'll offer tips for handling some different interview settings. We'll discuss the different rounds of interviews and what to expect at each of them. I'll offer some strategies for slam dunk answers, as well as ideas on how to formulate quality questions. And then we'll also talk about how to follow up after the interview is over. Now here's a recap of the homework from last week's session. Any victories, questions, wins, any feedback from the homework from last week? If so, please type it into the chat box. Okay, and just a reminder that these are strategies that you want to continue working on. Everything we've talked about in this whole webinar series, everything builds on itself, and these are all strategies that you want to incorporate into your daily and weekly strategies as you move forward with your professional development in your job search. Okay, so this week we're going to do the poll a little bit differently. Rather than give you a multiple choice question, I'm just going to ask you one question, and that is, what's one of the toughest interview questions you've received? And if you wouldn't mind sharing it, if you could just type it into the webinar chat box, and we'll take a look at these a little bit later in today's session. But most of us tend to, stumble on one or two questions that employers throw our way and aren't really sure what they're asking for and how to address them. So if some of those challenging questions come to mind, just type them in the chat box, and we'll reserve some time to review them and come up with some good strategies. Okay, so let's focus first on the purpose of the job interview. Let's start at the beginning and really understand what this whole conversation is all about. From an employer's perspective, they're looking at a few key things. They want to know, can you do the work? In other words, do you have the qualifications for the position? They also want a sense of, will you do the work? And this is more of an issue of motivation. Will you, when the going gets tough, will you get going and really contribute to the team, or are you going to be out doing something else? And then they also want to assess whether they want to work with you. In other words, is there a good fit between you and the organization? Now, most candidates forget that this is only half the equation, that you should be entering the job interview with your own agenda for what you want to learn from the interview. So you want to use the interview as a way to assess if you're prepared to do the work that this job is asking you to do. You want to discover if this is the, on the path for advancement that, or if, the path for advancement that this employer offers, is this consistent with your goals? Will this job position you for the next opportunity that you want? And is this organization's culture a good fit for your values and for your needs? You need to make, your goal with the interview is not simply to get the job. Yes, you want to get the job, but you also want to assess if this is the right job for you and whether you'll be successful with this particular opportunity. So the key in all of this is to be prepared. And this will help you clarify the strengths you want to promote as well as the questions you want answered. entering the interview with this type of focus will also be a great source of confidence and will help you present yourself in the best possible light. So to begin your preparation, please turn to the worksheet for today's session. On page 1, you'll see a section labeled Preliminary Employer Research. In order to show the employer you're the right employee for the job, you need to learn as much as you can about their organization. So some places you might want to search would include the job announcement, the organization's website, search engines like Google. Look at legal newspapers. So if you have access to them through Lexis or Westlaw, that's a great place to search. And you also want to search your network. You know, if you have been building relationships, as we've been discussing through our previous sessions, you can now turn to some of those folks that you've developed a relationship with and ask them, what do they know about this organization? What's their reputation? Do they know people there? You know, can they give you some feedback about the culture of that particular office? And then as like an extra credit tip, you might use these resources to also identify the competitors of this organization that you're interviewing with. You know, and then look at the 2 organizations or 3 organizations, however many competitors they have, and try to understand how they differentiate themselves. What words are they using on their websites? How do they position themselves to be different from other organizations that do similar work? And that will help you articulate what's unique about the employer you're meeting with and really what their professional brand is. Now, many job seekers know that they're supposed to do research, but they're unclear on what they're looking for or how to use this information. So we'll talk about some suggestions for the type of information you should be seeking. And these are also listed on page 1 of your handout. So you really want to understand the history of the organization. When was it created? Who created it? Why? You know, was there an opening in the marketplace? Was there a particular issue they were trying to address? Kind of what was the vision when they first started? Has the organization grown or changed significantly? What caused those changes? How has it changed? What words or culture does the organization use to describe their strengths and culture? What do you know about the attorneys in the organization? What traits do they share? What qualities do they celebrate? Do they have certain training in common? What success is the organization promoting? Is the organization experiencing any challenges? What are they? And the challenges you may not find on their website. That may be information you find more in newspapers or in talking to other colleagues, but that can be very important information for you to have. And you also want to have a sense of the organization's reputation in the community. And really answering these questions will give you a sense of the organization's strengths, culture, and priorities, and will give you some things that you want to focus on in your conversation when you meet with the employer. In addition to knowing about the organization, you need to understand the particular role that they're hiring for. So if there's a job announcement, I want you to print it out and read it line by line. And next, I want you to turn to page 2 of your worksheet and have it in front of you alongside the printed job announcement. Using the job announcement, you want to fill in the row of that chart on page 2, focusing on the row labeled They Want. So for example, in the Who box, make note of who the organization serves and if the employer tends to approach matters from a particular point of view. And actually, this actually may address the question that was just asked. So if the employer handles employment law, you know, do they represent employers or employees? If they handle malpractice actions, do they represent the doctors, the hospitals, or the patients? And we'll address your question in a couple of minutes, but it is important to have a sense of what their orientation is, what viewpoint they're representing, so that you can draw the necessary connections. Next, I want you to circle or highlight the verbs in the printed job announcement. Then list these skills that you've just circled in the How column on your worksheet. Underline other key items like subject matter, legal document types, legal procedures, and put these in the What column. And finally, what kind of organization is this? Where is it located? What community does it operate in? What are some of the cultural values of that organization? You can put these in that where column. Next, you want to reflect on what you bring to the position. In the row labeled I have, identify what you have that meets the employer's needs that you just listed in the row above. Any areas of overlap between what they want and what you have should be the points you'll want to emphasize in your interview. In the row labeled I can show, list specific examples and anecdotes that you can share as evidence of the qualities you've listed in the I have row. Think about how you can tell concise stories that showcase these strengths in a positive light. Your goal is to show the benefits of your experience, not just the features. For example, simply telling an employer that you were on the Environmental Law Journal may not mean much to them. However, if you show them that you developed specific environmental law expertise, that you learned how to write publishable quality work, and that you successfully met ambitious and inflexible deadlines, the employer can see how they will benefit from that experience. In the row marked "So what?", identify how the employer would benefit from your experience. You'll want to review the notes you've made on this worksheet before you enter any interview. So now that you have a sense of the employer's needs and priorities, as well as how you can meet them, it will be much easier for you to anticipate their questions and craft effective answers. My guess is that you've encountered some of the questions on this screen in past job interviews. Most job seekers are intimidated by open-ended questions, but with the preparation you've done, you'll hit these out of the ballpark. By expecting to receive these questions, even if the employer doesn't ask them per se or with exactly this wording, you can be prepared to wow your future employer. So let's address each of these questions and a strategy for answering them. So tell me about yourself. After all the preparation you've done throughout our webinar series, you should be excited to have the opportunity to answer this question. You've already done the hard work of identifying your brand and your target role and employer. So here's an opportunity to show the employer how you've been preparing yourself for this very job. Start with an opening sentence that highlights the themes you developed for your 10-second interview and brand homework. Next, add a sentence that shows the genesis of that interest. Then offer 2 or 3 specific examples of how you've developed the skills and knowledge you need to do the work effectively. These details make you memorable and add credibility to your statement. Wrap up by showing how this job is the natural culmination of your training. So for example, you could say, I'm really passionate about protecting the rights of workers who have been unfairly treated in their jobs. This grew out of my pre-law school experience working in the food service industry, where I saw many of my coworkers being mistreated. In law school, I prepared myself to handle these kinds of cases by working in our employment law clinic and participating in our rigorous litigation program. I'm excited to pull all of these experiences together to represent your clients in addressing their rights. Now, while the question can take different forms, most employers will ask you something of this nature. So practice your response. Nailing that first question with a successful answer will help frame the conversation in light of your brand and give you some confidence so that you can relax into the interview. Okay, so why do you want to join our team? This is an opportunity to use that research you've done on the employer. First, identify 2 or 3 specific examples or reasons why this employer appeals to you. Is it the clientele they represent, the way they formulate their case strategy, the kind of training they offer, the leadership role their attorneys play in the community? This is an opportunity to show that you've done your homework and are genuinely motivated to be a part of this team. Then go back and prepare an opening sentence that summarizes these qualities and a closing sentence that shows them how you would flourish in the environment this employer has created. So for example, you could say, I'm really excited about both your cutting-edge approach to case strategy and the early courtroom access you give to your new associates. I first learned about your firm when my employment law professor discussed your recent sexual harassment case in our class. I was really inspired by the way you frame the facts to highlight the real damage to your client. I'm also excited by the way your firm brings new associates into the courtroom. I am eager to use my litigation training to be a voice for your clients. What are your greatest strengths? Now, again, this is where you can use your research about the employer to shine. You have many strengths. To figure out which ones to highlight, you want to focus on how you can use your strengths to meet the employer's needs. When you reviewed the job announcement, what skills or qualities did the position emphasize? Are they looking for a problem solver, someone who can handle high pressure situations, someone who is meticulous with legal research? In other words, where do your strengths overlap with the employer's needs? These should be the strengths that you highlight. As in the prior questions, offer an example or two to showcase you using these particular strengths in a professional setting. These stories will also make you more memorable. What are your biggest weaknesses? Now, this one deserves some careful planning. You want to make sure that the weakness you offer doesn't go right to the heart of the job. For example, if you're applying for a district attorney position, you don't want to admit that you're terrible at speaking on your feet. Instead of pointing to weaknesses, I encourage you to think about some challenges you've dealt with and overcome. The employer will respond well if you acknowledge the vulnerability and then demonstrate motivation and fortitude in overcoming it. Turning a challenge into a strength is a compelling way to show your resilience and your fortitude. Begin with acknowledging a situation and the impact it was having on you. Identify the steps and process you took to overcome it, and then show the positive impact or result you are having as a result of your effort. So for example, you might say, when I started law school, I really struggled with time management. I was in the evening program and was working full time and had difficulty keeping track of everything. I quickly realized that I needed to make some changes if I was going to succeed in law school. I had a few colleagues who really excelled in this area, and I asked for their advice on what worked for them. I started to incorporate their suggestions and developed monthly, weekly, and daily task lists to make sure I stayed on top of short-term and long-term goals. I calendared time for specific tasks and adjusted my sleep schedule to capture an extra hour in the morning to study before work. It wasn't easy, but I really saw a difference in the way I was able to prepare when it came around for the bar exam. Most of my friends were overwhelmed by the task, but I just used my strategies and felt really good about what I was able to accomplish. Many employers utilize what's known as behavioral questions. You'll recognize these questions. Well, actually, let me go back. The point of these questions is to help employers predict how you might handle future situations by taking a look at how you handled similar situations in the past. And you'll recognize these questions because they'll typically start with, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of an experience where you, fill in the blank. Now, to answer these questions, you'll simply need to remember what you placed in that I can show row of your chart. The work's already been done. Now, you can use the job announcement to predict the types of behavioral questions they're likely to ask. Take a look at the skills that you circled when you reviewed the job announcement. These are likely to be the areas where they will want to see you in action. Employers will also use behavioral questions to gauge your judgment, your creativity, and your problem-solving skills. So in the resources listed on page 3 of your handout, you'll find a link to 75, actually the link is on page 4 of your handout, sorry about that, but you'll find a link to 75 of the most common behavioral interview questions. Review this list and have some anecdotes in mind that you can call upon in your interviews. Now, sometimes employers will try to gauge your problem-solving skills by asking hypothetical questions. These are most commonly found in district attorney and public defender job interviews, but they can appear in any type of job interview. And thankfully, your rigorous law school training has prepared you for these. Before the interview, it's helpful if you've refreshed your knowledge of the key legal issues in the area by reviewing notes from relevant classes or any study guides you might have. Pay careful attention to ethics rules, as these hypos often incorporate ethical gray areas. Now, if you're on an interview where they ask you a hypo, don't panic. Focus on listening to the scenario, ask questions if necessary to clarify any confusing details, and then take a moment to consider the question. If you do not have the substantive knowledge necessary to answer the question, let the interviewer know how you would go about problem solving to equip yourself to address the situation. In other words, you want to at least show them your resourcefulness. And you're likely to be asked questions about prior employers or other affiliations on your resume. You must always be positive about the way you speak about other people and organizations, and never reveal confidential information. You never know if the person interviewing you has a connection to your past employer. So even if they don't, this prospective employer will relate to the former employer. If they hear you speaking ill of an employer, they will worry you will speak the same way about them in the future. With this advance notice, find something positive, or at least neutral or objectively positive, about each employer, school, and affiliation on your resume. Now, I'll share with you my own anecdote that I once worked for an attorney who was very erratic and had a volatile temper. And whenever I was asked about working with that attorney, I would always talk about how much I admired his passion, his idealism, and tenacity, rather than, gossiping about his challenging interpersonal skills. Now let's pause here to take a look at the questions that you shared with me. So one of the questions from one of our participants was, we noticed you worked for an employer who had the opposite mission of the one that you're interviewing with right now. Why do you want to work here now? So in other words, if you worked for a plaintiff's firm and now you're interviewing with a defense firm, or if you used to work at the DA's office and now you're interviewing with the public defender. So this comes up pretty frequently, and there are a few ways to approach it, and you might actually think of some of the strategies I've already offered to you. So what do you have in common with this particular organization? So it may be that your passion is employment law or criminal law, regardless of the side. And if that's the case, you want to highlight that and be very genuine in your explanation and show with examples how you formulated that interest and why this particular position works for you. They are looking to make sure that you buy into the mission of the organization and their clients. So if it was a different side, you might even tell them that you took that other opportunity because it would give you opportunity in that particular area of the law, but that our heart has always been to represent the clients that this particular job is offering you to represent. So find ways to show you have something in common, that you buy into the mission of this organization, and show some credible ways of explaining why you took that opportunity that is less to do with who you were representing, but maybe the skills you were able to develop or the knowledge you were able to cultivate. So perhaps you accepted that other opportunity because you knew it would give you courtroom experience, or because you knew you would be able to do a lot of significant writing. And those are skills that will translate to this new employer. So in sum, for that particular question, you'd want to show the connection to the area of law, show what was positive, what you learned from that prior job that you bring with you to the new job, and show the connection you have with the plaintiff, or not the clients, or the point of view that this new employer has. So hopefully that answers it. Yeah, I would try scripting it out a little bit and practice saying it. It should be very genuine. You want it to be honest and authentic. You certainly wouldn't want to lie or mislead the employer. So you want to be able to structure an answer that is authentic and feels comfortable. And you might make an appointment with a counselor at Law Career Development to even practice that. That would also be a great strategy if you could do some mock interviews with a counselor or with someone you've met through your networking. And that's a really great question to practice and then get some feedback on your answer. So remember earlier when we discussed that interviews are a two-way street? The interview is as much an opportunity for you to assess the employer as it is for them to learn about you. I want you to approach your interviews with an abundance mindset, not a scarcity mindset. And with an abundance mindset, you understand that there are plenty of positions out there. Your job is to determine if this one is a good fit for your strengths and if it will help you meet your goals. Because you don't view this as the only job out there, which is a hallmark of the scarcity mindset, you will enter the interview with confidence. This kind of steady confidence is really appealing to employers. On the other hand, a candidate with a scarcity mindset believes that this is the only job out there, and if they don't get this job, they'll never get any job. They bring more anxiety and desperation into the interview process, and this undermines their credibility and their confidence. Think back to our discussion in session 3 about target employers and roles. What do you need to learn in the interview process to help you determine if this position is within your target? Using the bottom of the table on page 2 of your handout, formulate some questions that will help you assess whether the skills and knowledge you'll be developing in this job will help make you marketable for the next position. What kind of training and support will be available to you? What is the typical path for someone who starts in this role? What's the culture of the organization? And how does this particular position fit within the overall organization? How much autonomy, responsibility, and support will be available for you in this role? So, what are the things you really need to know about? And then start thinking about some ways you can ask the employer to get the information you need. And while much of your preparation involves anticipating the employer's needs, there are some strategic questions you can ask during the interview to reveal the information that the employer is looking for. And then that can help you be some strategic with some of your answers. So for example, you might ask the employer, when you think of some of your most successful new attorneys, what qualities did they share? And this will give you a list of the qualities that the employer prioritizes. Then you can find a way to showcase with your remaining answers how you've developed these very same strengths. You could ask the employer, can you tell me about a recent victory in the office? And that answer will give you a sense of what success looks like in the organization, and the way that they celebrate can reveal something about the office's culture. I also recommend asking, as the head of the, and then fill in the blank, litigation team, practice group, law firm, whatever the role of your interviewer is, what keeps you up at night? And this is an opportunity to understand and connect with their pain point. What is the problem, or what are the problems that your interviewer is trying to solve? And now that you understand what their concerns are, you can show them how you can resolve them, how the skills and experience and expertise you've developed can really fill a gap in this organization. So now that we have an understanding of how to prepare for the substance of the interview, let's spend a few minutes understanding the different stages of the interview process. The first stage is the screening interview, and it's focused mainly on assessing your credentials and to see if you're a good enough fit to advance you within the hiring process. This is often done by someone with an HR or recruiting role, although it could be the hiring manager. This is an opportunity for you to ask some questions to understand the general nature of the position and the hiring process. Now, sometimes these are conducted over the phone, or they could take place in person. If you make it through that screening, so if you show them you have the right skills for the job and seem to have the right fit, they'll advance you to more of an in-depth interview process. And that's where the employer will really assess whether you're a good fit for the position. And they'll ask most of the questions that we've been spending our session preparing for. Many employers try to introduce the candidate to several members of the team, either through a group interview or a series of one-on-one interviews. And it's from these interviews that the employer will likely narrow down the field to just a few finalists. And if you've done well enough through this process that you make it to the finalist stage, there's probably just a few folks at that point, a few candidates competing for the position. This is an opportunity for the employer to make sure that all the key stakeholders have an opportunity to meet the strongest candidates and offer their feedback. They also find that seeing the finalists in close succession helps to compare and contrast them. This may be an opportunity to test any further questions or concerns that the employer or you have that may be lingering. Now, it's not uncommon for you to get very little advance notice before you're scheduled for that first interview. So to avoid scrambling at the last minute, take some time whenever you submit your application to make sure that you have some things ready. And there's a checklist on page 3 of your handout. So you want to make sure you have your interview suit clean, pressed, ready to go. You want to have hard copies of the applications that you've submitted. You want to have a transportation strategy to get to the interview. You want to have already done some analysis of the employer and the position and the points you want to highlight. And you likely did most of this when you drafted your cover letter. Once you know you've been invited for an interview, you'll want to use that as a starting point for the more in-depth preparation we've talked about today. You'll also want a strategy in place in the event you need to do the interview over the phone or via Skype. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. When you're contacted for the interview, it's appropriate to ask with whom you'll be meeting. Do some research to know who these people are, where they attended law school, and what their role in the organization is. Before you begin your interview, you want to put yourself in the right mindset. When we're nervous, we tend to breathe shallowly, and this affects our posture and tone of voice. So to prevent this, take 3 deep breaths right before you enter your interview. And this will get oxygen to your brain and calm your nerves and help settle you so that you have that right mindset of sort of a calm confidence. We also want to remember to breathe during the interview. That will help you think better, you will be more at ease, and you will appear more confident. I also recommend that you cultivate an attitude of curiosity. Obsessing about how you compare with other candidates puts you in a defensive, insecure frame of mind, and that'll leak into the interview. Instead, I want you to cultivate an attitude of curiosity. Before you enter your interview, focus on, being curious about what you might learn about the employer and the opportunity. Really wonder, what is it that this organization does well? How do they do it? How have they been successful? This will make it easier for you to find opportunities to create a connection between your strengths and the employer's needs. We've spent most of our time today discussing the content of our communications with prospective employers in the interview process. But it's equally important to understand some of the logistics and nonverbal communication that occurs in the interview. To do this, we need to tailor our communication style to the unique dynamics that arise during 3 different interview settings. And so we'll talk about in-person interviews, telephone interviews, and video interviews. So unless you're applying for jobs in a different location, you are most likely to experience in-person interviews. I want to share some general tips that at first may sound obvious to you, but as someone who was responsible for hiring many staff members when I worked at GGU, and for a career services office no less, I was shocked at how often people didn't mind these details. So again, you want to dress appropriately. So you should wear a suit. It should be well-fitting. Your shoes should be in good repair. Now, while the suit should be appropriate for legal position, you can add a personal flair through an interesting tie or other accessories. Just make sure it's appropriate to the culture of the office. Carry a professional-looking bag, so not a backpack. Contain neatly organized copies of your application materials and anything the employer has asked you to bring. I recommend that you plan to arrive at the site of the interview at least 20 minutes early. This will give you time if you get stuck in traffic, if you get lost, if you have difficulty parking, you want to create a little bit of a buffer. So you might even plan to get there earlier than that. And then check in for the interview about 10 minutes early. Okay, so you might arrive on site and just find a place to sit and calm down or use the bathroom, but then actually check in 10 minutes before the interview. And that'll give you some time, if you get there early, to review your notes, take some of your deep breaths, and just start to get focused on the interview. After you've checked in for the interview, look around the waiting area. If there's information about the employer on the walls or displayed on the tables, take a look. Observe the people who work in that office. What kind of interactions are they having? Is there laughter? Do people work with their doors open or closed? What clues can you gain about the firm's culture just by what you're observing? Now put your cell phone away when you check in for that interview and make sure it is powered off while waiting for the interview and during the interview. When your interviewer comes to greet you, you don't want to have your face buried in your phone. Instead, you want to be able to connect with them right away and show them that you are ready to have a conversation and you're excited to be there. And when someone comes to greet you for the interview, stand up, smile, extend your hand for a handshake, make eye contact, and introduce yourself by saying your first name and last name slowly. When you enter the interview room, greet anybody else who might be in there in the same way with a smile, handshake, and an introduction. Listen carefully when they introduce themselves and try to use their names right away to help you remember them. Maintain eye contact with your interviewer. If there are multiple people in the room, make eye contact with each of these interviewers throughout the interview. So as you look around the room, keep focused on each person for 10 or 20 seconds so that you feel like you've made that connection with them. Each person in the room is important regardless of job title. So don't make the mistake of thinking because they have an administrative role or they're lower on the hierarchy that their opinion doesn't count. Their opinion counts. And frankly, that goes for every person you meet when you arrive at the interview. So from the security guards when you enter the building, to the receptionist, to everyone you meet along the way, you want to be friendly and make a good impression. When you sit down at the interview, sit in the middle of your chair. Try not to lean all the way back. You want to sit upright with your feet on the floor, and if anything, lean forward a little bit. Smile when greeting your interviewers and at key moments in the conversation, such as when you explain your enthusiasm for the position or when you're discussing some of your achievements. This will make you seem enthusiastic about the opportunity, and it makes you more inviting as a future colleague. The interviewer will likely control the flow of the questions, especially in the beginning. Find ways to incorporate your prepared questions throughout the conversation. This is where your attitude of curiosity will really come in handy. Now, it's not uncommon for you to encounter employers who want to conduct the interview over the phone or by video conference, and there are some unique tips that I'd like to share for these settings. So one thing that might seem counterintuitive is to dress nicely for a phone interview, even if you're not going to be seen. Wearing clothing that makes you feel confident and professional will help you project an attitude of confidence. Make sure you have a good quality phone line. If possible, I'd recommend using a landline instead of a cell phone so that you have better reception and coverage. The last thing you want is for the phone to drop or the call to drop in the middle of the conversation. You also want to be in a location where you can speak privately and without distractions. Back when I was in law school, it was in the days before we had cell phones, so we had to use pay phones on campus. And those pay phones happened to be located inside the bathroom in the library. So it was a really difficult place to have a job interview because you could hear flushing toilets in the background. So that's exactly the kind of scenario I want you to avoid. Make sure you don't have any sort of distractions for you or for the employer. Now, when you're doing your phone interviews, consider standing up rather than sitting down. This position allows you to open up your diaphragm and get more air to your lungs. You're also less likely to ramble when you're standing than when you're sitting. Some people treat phone interviews like open book tests and have tons and tons of notes in front of them. Be careful. If you are truly focused on your conversation, you won't even be able to reference all those notes. Um, you also don't want to be distracted by all kinds of things in front of you. So I'd recommend having just a few visual reminders of what you'd like to share. Maybe a post-it with a couple of bullet points, or you could just have the chart from this week's homework, or anything more than that's likely to be a distraction. And then depending on how you handle stress, consider putting a visual reminder in front of you to remind you to breathe or slow down or smile. Studies have shown that our smile can be heard over the phone and that it improves our tone of voice and makes the employer want to engage with us more. For video interviews, such as Skype or FaceTime, you want to first make sure that you have a reliable connection and that you have whatever software is necessary for the call. Make sure you have adequate bandwidth to avoid interruptions in the call. If you're using the camera that's built into your laptop, I recommend that you prop up your computer on top of a couple of your law books so that the camera is either at or just above your eye level. You want to avoid that, the impression that you're looking down at the interviewer. Be mindful of where you set up your camera and make sure you are clear on what's going to be happening in the background. You want it to be a very neutral or professional setting. Unlike the phone interview, I recommend that you don't have notes in front of you. If you must have a couple of notes, I'd say put them on a couple short notes on Post-its and then post those notes right next to your camera lens on your computer so that you're continuing to make eye contact with the camera. Again, remember to smile frequently as you're trying to engage the interviewer and build rapport despite having a technological barrier between you. Regardless of the setting, as the interview draws to a close, it's a good idea to ask the interviewer about the hiring process and when you can expect to hear from them. You want to reiterate your interest in the position, highlight any particularly exciting aspects that you learned about in the interview. If there were key messages that you have not had the opportunity to make, now is your chance. You could reiterate your interest in the position and highlight the 2 or 3 qualities that you think will make you a strong fit. And if you're meeting in person, be sure to shake the hand of every person in the room before leaving. When it's time to go, leave the interview promptly. But within 10 minutes of leaving that interview, I want you to find a quiet place where you can take out your pad and generate some notes. So this could be in your car, on the bus, at the nearest Starbucks, on a bench on the street, whatever it is. Pull out your pad and ask yourself, what were you asked during the interview and how did you answer? Did each interviewer have a different focus to their questions? And if so, what was it? What did you learn about the interviewers? What information did you want to clarify in your thank you note? So if you had the perception that maybe they were confused about something you said, maybe you'd want to clarify that in your thank you. Are there more questions that you have in the event that you're invited to another round? And what did they tell you about their hiring process? When did they say you would hear something? And so write down the answers to all those questions, because you'll find the more time that elapses between when you leave the interview and when you have an opportunity to debrief with yourself, you'll start to forget some of these key details. Later that day, write a thank you note to each person who interviewed you. These can be, by email or handwritten, but they must be professional and they must be personally tailored. Now, if the interviewer told you they're making a decision later that day, then you'll want to send your thank you by email because if you put it in US mail, they won't receive it in time. So you certainly want to pay attention to their time frame. Thank the interviewers for sharing their time with you and for telling you about the opportunity. Reiterate your interest in the position. Mention some specific elements of what you find exciting about the job. Consider clarifying something if you felt like you weren't clear or you were concerned, or you perceived that they were concerned about a particular point. So get the note out that day. And I will tell you that I have seen several situations where a well-written, thoughtful thank you note tip the scales in favor of hiring a candidate. Now, after some time goes by, if you have not heard from the employer by the time that they told you that they would contact you, it's perfectly appropriate for you to follow up with your primary contact to see if you can get an update on the status of your application. So today, just to recap, we talked about how you can use the previous work that you've done in defining your strengths and identifying your target job to prepare for today's interviews, or for these interviews. We developed strategies for preparing for your interview, including ways to anticipate the questions you will be asked and how to prepare knockout questions. We reviewed the various types of job interviews, as well as the unique logistics for phone and video interviews. And as with our conversation about networking, we also talked about the importance of following up in a timely and professional manner. So this week's homework is listed in your handout on page 4. So I'd like for you to complete that interview preparation worksheet that's on page 2 for a job you might have an interview for, or if you don't know yet if you're having the interview, take a job that you've submitted an application for and start working through that worksheet. Prepare to receive the question, tell me about yourself. And what are 3 points you want to include that are relevant for this particular job? Rehearse your answer and get some feedback. Reflect on what were some of the hardest interview questions you've received. And now with the information we've discussed today, prepare an answer to each of those questions. And what are 3 questions that you want to ask at your next job interview to help you decide if this will be the right job for you? I also want to draw your attention to the resources listed on page 4 of your handout. There are lots and lots of articles on the GGU Law Career Development blog that are focused on interviewing. Lots of tips and resources, sample questions, all kinds of good things to help you. So I've included a link to help sort the articles that are on the GGU Law Career Development blog that relate to interviewing. I've also included a link to an article about body language and what that says to employers and why we need to pay attention not just to what we say, but how we say and what we're communicating with our presence. I've already mentioned the list of the 75 behavioral interview questions. And then I also want to point out a podcast that I have listened here too, called Find Your Inner Voice in a Job Interview. And that podcast had lots of really helpful tips on how to connect with employers and how to formulate answers that are authentic to you and will have high impact. Any questions before we leave today's session? So next week is our final week together. We will discuss what happens when you get that job offer. How do you decide whether to accept or decline, and how do you go about that process? How do you negotiate compensation? And we'll also talk about the importance of keeping law career development informed of your job search status. We'll also talk about what it's like to talk to friends and family during your job search. I know this comes up a lot this time of year as we approach the holidays, and sometimes that can feel a little awkward. And so I'll offer some tips on how to navigate through those conversations. We'll also reflect on the progress that you've made throughout this webinar series, and I'll offer some daily practices to support you in your job search. And finally, we'll work on an action plan. So where do you go from here? How do you take what you've learned over these past 6 weeks and use that information for success as you move forward? So unless I see any other questions, I think that is it for today's webinar. It's great to have you join me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.